Good afternoon. My name is Heather Hughes. I am Trust Lead Professional for Humanities. And what I want to spend a little bit of time going through with you is the idea about collaborative learning and collaborative learning in humanities. And also sort of have a think about and a discussion about whether or not collaborative learning and group work are actually the same thing or they're actually something quite different. So I'd like to start with a quote from Sarah Alston from a book with Daniel Sobel, The Inclusive Classroom, from a couple of years ago. And Alston puts forward this quote. I think it's a really good starting point when we're thinking about collaborative learning and getting our students to work together in the classroom. And she said, the greatest benefits and challenges for children in the classroom can be delivered through group work. It takes careful management, planning, and explicit teaching of group work skills to ensure that the benefits outweighs the challenges. And I think that's something that we've really got to have a bit of a think about is the planning to collaborative learning, and whether we think that it it actually leads to hopefully successful learning. So you might want to press pause and have a bit of think about this, or if you're sat with someone, you might want to have a bit of a chat with this and be really honest. What sort of teacher are you? Are you the sort of teacher that actually avoids group work or collaborative learning, as we're going to be looking at in this session? Or do you work with colleagues that organise avoiding lessons where students are put together to work? Um, it is something that you can see as perhaps risky, or sometimes it might even be the word dangerous, to put some of our students together in the hope that they use that chance in a really positive way. But there are also lots of perhaps practical reasons that we might feel a little bit like that character in the photograph when the thought of group work or collaborative work is put forward. And here's some ideas about why we might shy away from it. There is the genuine problem that students need to work at different speeds. So how does that work if you're going to put them together, working on a shared activity task? And so what do you do? Do you have to group ability-wise? Or are have you got mixed ability groups? That might be impossible. Particularly obviously at GCSE as well, where we revert back often because we're optional subjects into mixed ability. So how does that impact? Would that be a reason that you might shy away from group work? The idea that, well, with group work, you've always got that one student that just takes over, and therefore it's not group work. It kind of becomes some kind of de facto dictatorship almost. So, well, what's the point? I might as well just, leave them as they are. Quiet students, you will often see when group work's mentioned that students sort of positively sort of shrink down into their seats. They don't like the experience. They don't feel comfortable in that experience. So, why would we put them through it? We've got class dynamics. We've got students who just don't get along. And sometimes it's really hard to work your groups out where there's a couple of people that don't get along and they're put together. The cruisers, as I call them, the people that cruise through the idea of group work, because for them, they're in the group, but they're certainly not going to do any work. And therefore, other students are having to do more. But also, you've got these students who won't have any understanding, who won't have picked up the key points that you wanted. That was the whole sort of reason for you to be putting this activity together. Time. Well, particularly for, I would argue, our exam groups, we are pushed for time. So there is that issue. It takes too much time. I can't weave it into my curriculum. I can't weave it into one of the activities that I am going to pursue this week with my group because I don't have that time. Resulting understanding, it can be patchy. The detail's not always been arrived at. As a teacher, you might say, I feel like I end up just going back through it again the following lesson. So I've wasted all that time, all that effort, and my students aren't anywhere near the learning intentions, the success criteria. So why should I bother? And finally, that it's not necessarily expected in schools that you have a specific group work, a specific collaborative style of learning within classrooms. It's not expected. You don't have to do it. So why am I going to risk all the points above to do that? And it's a fair question to be asking yourself. It's not an expected facet to planning a lesson, so why am I putting it in there? It's risky. So these are lots of reasons why we might avoid it, why our colleagues might avoid it, why it's not necessarily something we do regularly, why if it is done, it can often be an occasional thing. Um, and we have to accept that these are factors, definitely. Well, let's take a look at these two quotes. We've got one from the Education Endowment Fund, the EEF, and we've got one from the Educationist Dylan William. But if we look at the EEF first, the EEF talks about collaborative learning, and effective collaborative learning is more than putting some students together and asking them to work as a group. What it actually should be is asking them to work in a very structured approach with tasks specifically designed for students to be working together. I think that's really important. It's not, perhaps taking something that they could do on their own. And we will come back to that. There is a specific reason for that. And that actually, if you do structure it and if the tasks are well designed, you can get some brilliant learning gains out of it. Collaboration can be competitive with groups sort of vying against each other, but it's not always necessary. I mean, in fact, the EF say that that could actually end up being counterproductive, that learners will focus on competition rather on learning aims. And therefore, you need to think very carefully about that. And obviously, it depends on your students. It depends on the groups that you're working with. What the EF does talk about, and you'll notice that I return to this, repeatedly during this session, is the idea of it promotes talk. It promotes interaction between learners, and that's where you tend to get the best gains, the best progress. I mean, some of you might be involved in the Oracy project that the Matt is been involved in. I know I am, and and Oracy is such an important aspect to our teaching and the learning that's going on in our classrooms. And collaborative learning is very much a key to that. Now, Dylan William, he kind of agrees with the EF that the idea of there is a higher level of achievement, you've got a greater sustained engagement from your students than perhaps you would be able to achieve if you are more traditionally teaching and setting them activities that perhaps they do on their own. And there's an idea that you can be collectively engaged, you as well as the students, and that everybody's learning and everybody's teaching each other. And therefore everybody is growing, that it's a joint venture. And that the classroom has got everybody harnessed, and that would back up what the EEF is saying, this idea that there are good gains, there are great learning gains by adopting this approach where it fits best. So for someone who might be sat listening to this thinking, I'd like the idea, but I'm a little bit nervous. Well, we start with paired work. I have shied away from group work. I've shied away from, what we're talking about this afternoon, collaborative learning. But I don't shy away from paired work. It's just what happens in the classroom. It can happen at the start of the lesson, part way through. It might be paired work as peer marking or peer feedback to each other. They might be looking at each other's work. It's something that we often do without even thinking. Now, that is collaborative learning. And it's perhaps a stepping stone to developing it into perhaps what you would consider more group work, where we've got more students working together. So a collaborative, as it tells you there, sorry, a collaborative activity is one that requires good interaction to achieve an effective learning. And that's it. That's all it is, really. And so the idea is that it usually revolves around a student learning through talk and discussion with others to solve a problem, or to, it might be, for example, in geography, looking at an inquiry question. It might be in history, looking at the significance of key points and having a discussion on which is the most important and why it is. So it might be, you know, it might even be something around, for example, a Diamond 9 activity. With paired work, there are some obvious gains, and you might feel that it allows a more effective use of lesson time. You might also consider that because you haven't got students having to move around the classroom, because you've got students who sat next to each other, you know, week on week, they understand each other, they get each other, that for you, it's more effective. And you do have to, whenever you're thinking about collaborative learning, getting students to work together on something, you do obviously have to weigh up the time that's spent on the activity, spent on preparing them for the activity, in relation to, well, what are the learning gains? What they're going to get from it? You know, I've got to balance this out. Particularly if it is, well, they're going to be in groups where it's going to require chairs being moved, they've got to move. And we know how that can suddenly turn into, you know, quite long-winded, you know, chairs being dragged along and so on. So paired work can be really useful for those short, sharp, collaborative activities. And it might also be a chance for you to develop your own sort of approach to collaborative learning as well. Now, within this idea of paired work is the idea of talk partners. So I did say we're going to dip into Oracy, but talk partners are a useful strategy. And what it allows is a student to really articulate their ideas with someone else, and someone else who's not the teacher, and someone else who's not the rest of the class. And I think that's really important for a lot of our students. And obviously, we're also taking into account that our students are perhaps shy, perhaps at that awkward point in their sort of young lives where they don't want to have to speak, you know, in front of other people. We've got students that their communication skills may well have been impacted by, and their confidence levels impacted by COVID. So the idea of talking to one person, articulating their ideas, you moving around, perhaps reassuring them what you're hearing between the two of them, or the feedback they're getting from their talk partner is correct and it, you know, it's enabling them, then I think it can be a really powerful strategy. And again, this is collaborative learning. You might not have just sort of considered it in that way, but for them to achieve either that level of confidence or that understanding or the depth to an answer they're going to provide, it could have only have happened because they've got a talk partner. It can only have happened because they've got their paired work, that, you know, they're in paired collaborative learning. So collaborative learning, yes, it encourages speaking and it encourages listening. And there was a study done by Douglas Barnes back in 2008. And what Barnes looked at was the idea of what he called explanatory talk. And this is the opportunity, a little bit like what we talked about, talking partners, for students to speak, but not to speak in just a way where the other person listens. Yes, you're right. But this is to sort out thoughts and ideas. So it's to sound out ideas to somebody, to get that feedback, but then to use that feedback to arrange the information, to arrange their ideas into different formats. And again, for our subjects, that can be really, really useful. It might be sorting out structure to an extended piece of writing. It could be looking at the levels of significance It could be looking at data. It could be anything for our geography and our history lessons. But the other point is that also it allows our EAL students. Now, we might not necessarily think that English as an additional language is something that would work really well in group work, because surely, it's going to make it difficult. Well, no, it allows them, as Bard says, for everybody. Exploratory talk is the chance to sort your thoughts out and get feedback. Well, imagine if you have that opportunity to sort your thoughts out, to get your feedback, when English isn't necessarily your first language. You're not being bombarded with lots and lots of ideas bouncing around. It's very small, it's very focused, it's very meaningful, and it allows EAL students to grow in confidence, but not at the disadvantage of the other students either, because everybody's getting something from it. There was a study back in '95 by Swain and Lapkin, and what they did was they looked at French speakers in Canada, and they considered that it did allow, if you did it in small groups, a gain in confidence. The reason being that because it was meaningful, because it wasn't taken out of context, it's really focused, then students have got a much better chance of understanding, and therefore the confidence gained. Now, there is a caveat. It was a small study, but I think when you consider the idea of small, focused conversations, we can see why perhaps Swain and Lapkin were recommending this when looking at French speakers in Canada. So let's think about what collaborative learning actually is. Well, Vygotsky, way back in the 60s, was already sort of talking about it and put forward this idea that learners are relying on each other to accomplish a task. So basically, if you weren't learning in a collaborative fashion, you couldn't complete the task on your own. Now, I think that's a really important way of looking at it. And I think for a lot of us, if we take that on board, it's going to make it different to perhaps group work. Because often group work, they could do it on their own, because we haven't necessarily really pushed the activity to its nth degree. We haven't really thought about it, perhaps, as carefully as we could. So that's what Vygotsky says. And just to go a little bit further, it isn't putting them into groups and expecting them to succeed. It isn't group work by proxy. And it certainly isn't that lone student dominating the group that they're in. Everybody has to work for the end goal to be achieved. It is impossible to achieve whatever the task is if you were working on your own. And I think the other thing that allows us to do is to really get the students to understand that there is a really specific reason that I'm working with these other people. It's not a chance to sit and have a bit of a chat and then at the last minute pull out some kind of idea that we can throw the teacher so that we don't get into trouble. This is very, very different. I cannot achieve the learning intentions, I cannot achieve the success criteria the teacher set out at the start of the lesson if I am not working alongside with my student colleagues, whether that's my talking partner, my learning partner, or whether it's 3 or 4 other people that I'm now sat with. And I think that's really important that we keep that in our heads when we're planning, when we're weaving this into our lessons and our curriculum. So what would we see? If we walked into a colleague's lesson and we've walked in there because they've said, oh, we're going to do some collaborative learning, come and have a look. Or if we're doing it and we're looking across our classroom, what would we see? We would see really strong student talk. We would see students really start to fine tune the language they're using and thinking about why they're using that language, and also listening really carefully, which I think for a lot of us, we would like our students to do more of. When students are in small groups, we can see them contributing thoughts verbally. And it's that middle section there where I've put share tentative ideas. If we can get them thinking tentatively, that's a good thing, because it means you're prepared to move on your idea, that your peers will test you on it. And you might go, you know what, you're right about that. Or no, I'm not sure you are right about that. I think it's because of this. And having that tentative process to your ideas and that willingness to learn and listen from the people around you and perhaps change your ideas, that's really important. And it provides perhaps a greater maturity to our students and to their thinking. The other point that we would see with collaborative learning is that everybody participates, even our quietest students, that it becomes a process where they feel they can, that they will explore their ideas with their peers, and that element of feeling awkward starts to dissipate. Now, it might well be that this is because it has to be something that you return to. Certainly, and it goes back to our paired work, we know that our students are more willing to contribute in smaller groups than to whole class discussion. And so it allows us as a teacher to initiate discussion in this way. It might be you are moving around. It might be they don't necessarily feed back to the whole class at the end, but they've been feeding back to you throughout because of your movement around, because of the way that you're live marking, you're checking on how they are getting on, you're pushing them, you're asking them to, you're probing what their understanding is, you're pushing them to give you ideas, and they will contribute more. And it goes back to the idea, I guess, of think, pair, share, that a lot of us have heard for many, many years through teaching. And then finally, it can involve students working on separate tasks that all contribute to a common overall outcome. Now, that might be the overall outcome is that the students in these separate tasks, they come together as a whole class, or it might be that it's a shared task, and again, that's for you to decide and for you to make that decision on where it best fits. And it might well be that it's something that you fine tune, and you're looking at your curriculum to see where that perhaps best fits. These 2 points I think are quite useful. So when you're using collaborative learning, when you've decided that you want your students working together, either in a small group or in pairs, that you think about a few points. And I think the first point is that you evaluate groups on their own merit. So if you have put them into perhaps groups of fours, that you don't compare across the classroom. So if you judge groups in relation to each other, students will feel it's success or failure, and it's not entirely in their own hands. So one idea might be that you give grades per how well each group met its goals, that how well each student performed in their specifically assigned role, in their particular duty. And that you think about, well, I'm going to reward you, and I'm going to share this at the start. I'm going to reward you by category. So it might be the group that best researched or had the most original solution. So you're thinking more carefully about, what do I want them to be looking at? What's their success criteria? And then it's thinking again about, well, how do I want to divide this work up? Am I going to give each group a different task? Delegating tasks, as it says there, gives each group a sense of importance, that you're working on something that's bigger than just you. And that's a useful feeling for our students to have. So they are important. Now, it might well be, depending on how you've grouped them, that you differentiate those activities, those tasks. It might, hopefully, that the students really, it's done subtly, but they really feel that they're important. Their particular activity, what they're going to do, when added together with the other groups, it leads to that solution, that understanding, that conclusion, whatever it is you're driving your class towards. And it's like a jigsaw piece. Each group is going to provide a jigsaw piece. And then suddenly, again, you've got this idea of, why are we doing this? This is collaborative. It's collaborative within our individual group, but actually what we find out, what we achieve when we add it to the other groups, oh, look what we've got. And that gives that buzz, that drive to your lesson. And the other point as well, if we're being a bit cynical, is it stops competition, which can, as we said earlier, it can sometimes be a distractor. But it also means that you haven't got one group saying to another, oh, what have you got? And literally just borrowing, because there's no point to that, obviously. And it can be ill-spirited, or it could be laziness. But actually, if you could design an activity where they're all providing something, they can't necessarily just copy from each other, it really makes it a useful process. And it gives them the understanding of why collaborative work can be really important and really, really, really powerful. So I hope that you've found that of interest. What I would like to do is just go back to where we started. I'm just going to zip back to what Sarah Alston said, that the greatest benefits and challenges for children in the classroom can be developed through group work, but let's call it collaborative learning. That if you think very carefully about how you want to manage it, if you plan it out in advance, if you think about perhaps as well, how am I going to share on my curriculum? How am I going to share in the classroom what collaborative learning looks like so the students understand it? What the benefit of it is, so they understand why they're doing it. Then the benefits will outweigh the challenges. And as I say, you don't have to start with groups of 5 and group 6. In fact, I'd say you don't actually really want groups that big, but perhaps start with paired work, really focus on what they're gaining from it, and then sort of push up in your numbers. But again, this idea of planning, and particularly with that last slide that we just looked at, this idea of, could you create activities where, one, they couldn't do it on their own, so it has to be done in a collaborative fashion, but two, that within their groups, they're providing a piece, and that only when all the groups have provided the pieces can they actually achieve the final outcome. And I think at that point, you've really got something powerful within the classroom. So I hope that has been of use. I think what you certainly want to perhaps think about is this idea that you don't have to worry too much about going straight into large groups, and that the idea of paired work is a really useful starting point, and obviously, really importantly, the role that collaborative learning can have with oracy. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you got some useful points from today's session.